Welcome to Clouds.Training. This is part 13 of OOPS Concepts training program. In this lesson, we will learn about interfaces. So what is an interface? An interface contains the definitions for a group of related functionalities that a class or structure can implement. Whenever a structure or a class that is derived from this interface, they must implement the functionalities that are defined in interface. An interface is like an abstract class. Remember, we have discussed about abstract classes and sealed classes in our previous lesson. So these abstract classes acts as a base class. We can use an interface like a base class. So whenever a derived class implements this interface, must implement all the members of it. An interface can't be instantiated directly. In the same way, we cannot instantiate an abstract class. Interfaces also cannot be instantiated on its own. So we need to implement it by a class or structure that implements the interface and create the instance of that class. Interfaces can contain events, indexes, methods, and properties. These properties methods need to be overwritten in the child class. Interface contains no implementation of the methods. When we are comparing this with abstract class can have the implementation of the methods. However, interfaces, we cannot have any implementation of the methods, and the child classes that are inheriting from this interface must implement all the methods defined in the interface. A class or structure can implement multiple interfaces. When it comes to abstract classes, they act as a base class and we cannot have multiple inheritance. We have discussed about this example in our previous lesson, inheritance. However, when it comes to interfaces, we can implement multiple interfaces in a child class. Now let's see an example of how to implement interfaces in our classes and structures. For this, let's switch back to Visual Studio. Here I have opened this Visual Studio, the solution from our previous lessons, which contains all the projects related to the topics that we are discussing. As always, we will be uploading the source code to GitHub public repository of Clouds.Training account. Here I have opened the main program. This is a console application. Let's see an example of interfaces now. Let's add our default console right to stop our console once the application is executed. Now let's create the interface. Here I have defined an interface which is called iMatch of generic type. So now to define an interface, we need to use the keyword interface, and it is always advised to use I before the name of the interface to easily identify it. Even though it's not mandatory, it is the best practice. This interface contains two methods, very simple methods. One is sum and another one is multiplication. So now, as we have mentioned earlier, we cannot have implementation of the methods in interfaces. If I try to implement, it will not allow. See, when I try to implement method, it says interface members cannot have the definition. So hence it is proved that we cannot have implementation. Only definition is allowed. Now let's create a class, and this class is inherited from the interface that we are creating here. For this, the generic type which we are passing as a class. Now we can see the red squiggly saying that in this class is inherited from the interface, but there is no implementation of the methods, that is sum and multiplication, defined in the interface. So to implement that, we need to define methods. For that, we'll create two properties called I and j, and multiplication is one method and sum is another method. This is very simple multiplication and sum functionality. So multiplication will accept object and it will do the multiplication. Now let's print the sum and multiplications to the console by creating object of this class. So to create an object, we need to use a keyword new and instantiate using the syntax shown here. This object holds the instance of this class. Now let's assign I and j values of this object and print the sum. Here if you notice object.sum, we are calling object.sum and passing the same object to this method. Here we can see that this sum accepts this object. Now let's print the multiplication. When we run this application, we can see that sum is printed as 3. Since it is 1 and 2, it's just printed sum 3 and multiplication is 2. Now let's use the structure and implement the interface in our structure. So for that we will use the same syntax, I match, and the name of the structure is my struct. In this, it's still saying that we need to implement the members. So let's implement those members. Once we have implemented these members, we can create the variable for the structure and define the values of I and j as 10 and 20. Now let's print the same sum and multiplication. This is multiplication to the console. This is multiplication, and run the application. We can see that sum and multiplication are printed. The concept here is how we are implementing the interface. So this is how we can implement the interface in structures and classes. Now let us try to create a private variable in interfaces. Then it is not allowed. That means in interfaces we cannot use access modifiers. By default, all the methods, indexes, and properties defined in the interface are public. Now if I try to implement a method, it will not allow because implementation is not part of interface. Now let us try to create a static member which is also not allowed. We can see that the modifier static is not valid in this item. Now let's try to create another static class. Let's say the static class is my static class, which also tried to implement IMAS interface. Now when we see the error here, it clearly shows that static classes cannot implement interfaces. This is also one of the limitation. Static classes do not implement interfaces. That's it. Those are the basic concepts of interfaces. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.